with Jackson, but Jackson is more than just while he was president. He influenced what would be American politics for the 1830s, 1840s, and the beginning of the 1850s. It would not, basically you could kind of give as a year of when the things really changed the most would be 1854.
What did he do after presidency?
He lived for a while. He went and lived at his plantation in the Hermitage and in Tennessee. He wasn't a real long time that he lived. I can't remember how long, but he still was around and his advice. So. All right, our next president was Van Buren. He was handpicked by Jackson to succeed him. He had been his vice president, and I mean when Jackson picked him, he had no problem winning. The Whigs weren't really that organized yet. It was actually their first official election, second official election as Whigs. They did put up Henry Clay. Believe it or not, he doesn't lose this election. What they decided to do is, well, let's get it where we get regional candidates and make it where nobody has a majority in the Electoral College. Because what happens if there's not a majority in the Electoral College? Okay, it goes to the House of Representatives. So they were figuring, we can't beat Van Buren straight out, but if we get in New England, we have Daniel Webster running. We have Harrison out west, and there. We have White in the south. We can kind of make it where we go to House of Representatives, and who knows what will happen, whether it be like another corrupt bargain type of thing. So that's where they went. But they didn't get enough there. Van Buren still ended up winning. You see with the map here, Van Buren had pretty high, even with the, he even had 51% of the popular vote. So even him versus 3 other people, going against 3 others, and there. He is our 8th president. He is a Democrat. The term "okay" comes from him. His nickname, and this is trivial, but it's kind of good to know, was Old Kinderhook. And so sometimes, instead of signing his name, he would just write, he would do his initials for the name of "okay," and he would "okay" it. So that's where the term "okay" comes from. It. I had the question: how is Van Buren like George H.W. Bush? All right, Bush 41. How is he like him in history?
Reagan's vice president?
He gets picked after a year.
Yeah, do you ever want to succeed somebody that was very popular? And Van Buren goes after Jackson. Is he going to be able to fill Jackson's shoes? Is George H.W. Bush going to be able to fill the shoes of Ronald Reagan? No. I mean, that's one of those things that you have. And that's one thing that they both have. Then you have the next thing that ended up happening. And this is where they both inherited a bad economy. Does the president before them get blamed for the economy? No, they get blamed for it. And what is kind of odd with both of them, they both get blamed for this bad economy because of the fact of something the president before them did. You remember the bank war that we had? We got specie circular. That causes the Panic of 1837, which during the entire presidency of Van Buren, we're in a recession. George H.W. Bush, we would have a banking crisis, believe that or not. And the banking crisis, a lot of that could be traced back to in the 1980s when President Reagan would push for deregulation of banks there, and what we would have with junk bonds, and it would cause a recession then in the latter part of George H.W. Bush's election, which it would be blamed on Bush. But we could actually say, well, this is kind of Reagan's fault. Does Reagan get blamed for anything? No. Reagan can't get blamed. It's got to be Bush. Jackson, Reagan, both loved by the people, very dynamic. Van Buren and Bush, well, they're more boring. They're not someone that you wanted to be around. I mean, it's like Reagan, he could charm a crowd. Jackson could charm a crowd. Van Buren and Bush, well, they're real smart, but you actually want to go talk, hear a smart person talk. Okay, and they both ended up with 1-year terms. They also both kind of were seen as out of touch with the common person.
Wait, I thought we did. Oh, his son didn't run for the dad didn't know.
So this is Bush 41. And they both really ended up just being the wrong place of history. Because as we look back at Van Buren, we kind of see that, all right, really he wasn't that bad a president, he just had a bad situation. And with George H.W. Bush, he ended up with a situation. Although George H.W. Bush ended up with the highest popularity of any president since after World War II. And this kind of tells you for Americans, 2 years before he's running for re-election after the Desert Storm and the Persian Gulf War, he had the highest popularity and approval ratings. Nobody was running a run against him because there's no way you're going to beat him. 2 years later, his approval rating is extremely low. We as Americans, we vote according to our pocketbook. And a governor from Arkansas beats him. And this is where all the top Democrats were like, oh, we can't run against Bush, he's going to win. And this is where Bill Clinton says, well, hey, I'll take the opportunity. And he kind of emerges out of a group that people didn't think. And said he happened to be at the right place at the right time. That's where you kind of see with history and doing a correspondence of some people that are a lot alike. All right, we have a new state. We're going to go through about how Texas breaks away and the next unit in there. But Texas breaks away. They form their own country, the Republic of Texas or Lone Star Republic. You can call it either way. As soon as they make their own country, they apply for statehood. Jackson, Van Buren, they were like, for Congress, don't even look at it. Don't touch it. What issue would scare Jackson? Does that scare Jackson enough that he says, we're not going there? Mexico is scaring Jackson. You think that Andrew Jackson was worried about this little nation of Mexico? Even though Mexico said, if you accept Texas in, we're going to fight you. Do you think that really scares Andrew Jackson?
Making an alliance with Britain, probably.
Do you think Jackson's scared of Indians? Alliance with Britain? No, but I just thought we're friendly enough with Britain. We're not really having too much in there with it.
France.
His mom.
Everybody's scared of mom.
Oscar. Jackson.
Okay.
What issue do you think would be the one dividing issue? Yes, slavery. And this tells you how much of a politician Jackson was. He didn't back down to hardly anything, but when it came down to, he realized if we accept the state of Texas or Texas in as a state, that issue of slavery could split us up. And Jackson's like, I don't think I can handle this. And Van Buren said the same thing. So they do it, and they basically pass it along. All right, later on, we will accept Texas, and it will be a problem with stuff. But that kind of tells you for that the issue of Texas and the issue of slavery, how unfortunate it was.
Because it would be really prevalent in Texas.
Well,
split the slave.
You could, and this is where they were looking at things. They could actually, when Texas was looking to join, and at one time they were actually looking at making 5 different slave states. Remember that Missouri Compromise and that balance? Were there 5 states in the north ready to come in? Much less, they were looking at things, is there even one in the north ready to come in? Because during this time is when we're having places like Florida come into the United States and other places. So we've been keeping it even, one slave, one free, one slave, one free, and keeping it even. Well, something as big as Texas, all right, and the South looked at it, they said, yeah, we can really sway it to our
But
advantage.
wouldn't it be a non-slave state because it was below the 36?
And that would
It would be below, so that because they would have popular sovereignty, they could choose either way since it was below that line. And they already had slavery. Even though Mexico outlawed slavery, and this is where we'll get to next year, Mexico outlawed slavery, but when the Americans moved to Texas, which was part of Mexico, we still brought the slaves, even though it was against the law there.
We're a bunch of rebels.
All right, remember the bus? Jackson killed the bus, the whole thing with the pet banks and all that. Except for, we didn't have the Panic of 1837. What is one of the main reasons why we will have this recession?
Cereal.
Yeah, we have a problem with the banking system. And how are we going to fix these banking problems?
More money.
Well, not really so much print more money, but we need to have a stable banking system. We need a Bank of the United States. So, Van Buren ends up getting what he called the Independent Treasury. The Independent Treasury is the Bank of the United States. Van Buren made the same thing that Hamilton wanted, the same thing that Henry Clay had wanted. He's a Democrat. The thing that Jackson killed, Van Buren says, we got to have this back. Well, let's just call it a different name. Just like today, we have it today, we call it the Federal Reserve. It is the Bank of the United States that Hamilton wanted for the most part there. You see here with the initial OK on it. How do you think Jackson felt about his hand-picked guy reviving the thing that he killed?
He didn't like it. Well, he liked it because it wasn't him who played.
Well, he still didn't like it because he didn't like the bank. So what do you think in the next election, and Jackson was still around at that time, is he going to give you support to Van Buren? No. And so basically the Democrats are hanging out on the win, the next one. Van Buren's running for re-election, but without Jackson's support, it isn't helping him much. All right, kind of hodgepodge of things in here, but after John Marshall, our next Chief Justice, which will probably be our fourth most important Chief Justice to remember in history. A lot of them, not that they don't matter, but they don't matter to you all history-wise, but Roger Taney. Jackson appointed Roger Taney as the Chief Justice. The Taney Court, instead of the Marshall Court, they were the opposite of the Marshall Court because they took states' rights over federal power. Remember, Marshall was federalist, federal power. But this is where we're Taylor. The one case that you're going to really need to know, and it's actually in the next section, is with the Dred Scott case, and it deals with slavery. But you don't really need to know it with it right now. But that's where they are for states' rights, not for national rights. And then 1840, we have the emergence of the greatest president of the United States. Okay, and remember here in 2040, at his bicentennial, all right, the Whig Party, we are coming back alive and reviving in honor of William Henry Harrison. Now, Tippecanoe and Tyler too was the slogan. What is Tippecanoe?
The Battle of the Indians.
Yeah, the battle with the Indians. Because who won it?
Harrison.
Yeah, Harrison. So he's using his fame as an Indian fighter. What's Ann Tyler too?
John Tyler.
Yeah, John Tyler is vice president candidate. So they're running together. They're using a name together. He would run with what was called a log cabin campaign. He's a common man. He's just like Andrew Jackson. Andrew Jackson was an Indian fighter. Harrison's an Indian fighter. War hero, wave a bunch of flags, do the same thing. Andrew Jackson, well, he was for the common man. He was born in a log cabin and grew up, became rich after that. Well, William Henry Harrison, he did the same thing, except for, did he ever live in a log cabin?
No.
No, there wasn't a bit of truth to it. Are we worried about truth in a campaign? No, they actually had a log cabin that they brought around on the campaign trails and all as basically a prop, to show with it. He was for hard cider. Basically, he's a common person. He's going to sit there and drink whiskey with a common person, hard cider. Except for William Henry Harrison didn't drink. But are we worried about a truth with that for our campaign? See, he's running against Van Buren. Van Buren, they started making him look like he was just this rich guy, doesn't understand what's going on in the real world. All right, he's there sipping his wine. All right, you want the guy that's over counting his money, sipping his wine, or do you want the tough guy there with his cup of hard cider?
So Van Buren, they make him sound like a little girl.
Yeah, well, they made basically they made him sound like an elitist, the complete opposite of Andrew Jackson. Economy's bad. You got this rich guy that doesn't know what's going on for common people. You gonna re-elect him? What's really ironic with this is probably anybody at all could have won the election for the Whigs at that time. Even Henry Clay could have won. And here was Henry Clay's one chance to do it. And what did they do? They pick a guy that just basically stood there, didn't say anything, and you wave a whole bunch of flags. And William Henry Harrison then wins the election. Okay, Van Buren's our Democratic candidate, and Harrison. What?
Why didn't Clay run?
The Whigs were wanting to win, and they figured they would make it common man type of campaign. All right, Harrison was so popular, let's just go with him. And you see, my electoral college, okay, Harrison won, especially out west, won up in the northern area. There's scattering of things for Van Buren, but Van Buren would lose re-election in this case. And then we would come to the greatest month in our nation's history. can you tell me anything that went wrong from March 25th, 1841 in the next 30 days?
Tecumseh's curse.
Well, that's not, I mean, that's just because Tecumseh there, but that was like the greatest month I've ever lived through. I mean, that was just amazing. All right, peace and harmony throughout the United States. So, that's why William Henry Harrison is our greatest president. Because can you name me one thing that he did wrong, or one bad thing for our country in that month? Why did he die after 1 month?
He had tuberculosis.
Is he the one doing the speech in the rain?
Yeah, which we know that this speech actually didn't cause him that, but he got pneumonia, which might have been with other things, but you don't get pneumonia from being in the cold, supposedly, but it helps lower your immunity there. So, but he got pneumonia and ultimately would end up dying after 1 month. So who takes over when Tippecanoe dies?
John Tyler.
Yeah, Tyler too becomes the president. First time that we have a vice president, his nickname is his accidency, because he's president by accident. The thing is, we never had it happen before. If a vice president takes over, is he actually president?
Yes.
We didn't know. And some people were saying, no, you're not. John Tyler says, I haven't. And he acted like he was president. He did everything as if he was president, which he actually set the precedent that from now on, every vice president took over, assumed the duties completely. It is not a, okay, well, you get to do some of this. You're just holding the seat until the next election. There, they took it. But here's where we come to the major part for John Tyler. Remember, the Whigs finally win office. It's not Henry Clay. Harrison dies. Tyler takes over. One of the first things that John Tyler does as president is he vetoes an internal improvements bill.
Ow.
Remember Henry Clay and his American system? He now has a president in office just to rubber stamp what he wants. Except for, what does the president do?
Doesn't do what he wants.
Kills it. The Independent Treasury, the one that Van Buren started, the one that Henry Clay is saying, see, I told you, we need this bank. And John Tyler kills it. Would he be in a very good Whig?
Nope.
His cabinet resigned. No Whigs will serve in his cabinet. He replaces them with Democrats.
Got a problem.
So for the Whigs, you finally get a guy that's president, and truthfully, you have a Whig president for 1 month. Even though John Tyler has a W by his name, is he actually a Whig? He's a Democrat for all purposes. All right. And I have on the question, how does Clay like this? He doesn't like it because everything that Clay is getting done in Congress is getting vetoed. All right, diplomacy. 2 things, 2 ships. That's why they're in italics. The Caroline incident. We are insurgents or people trying to break away. We're trying to help some Canadians break away. Does Britain like the fact that we're helping getting them weapons to break away?
Yes.
And so this, no they don't. Then we have another ship, the Creole. And in the Creole, there are some slaves that are trying to escape. They get to the Bahamas. Now the Bahamas at that time are owned by Britain. When they get there, Britain says they're free. So the British are helping us. And so those are some things, we have some problems with Britain. Are we going to fight them now? No, we're not going to fight them now. And what ends up happening is we also have a third thing, the Aroostook War. And what this is sometimes nicknamed the Lumberjack War. Up in the northern part of Maine, very northern part, on the border of Canada, we're fighting over some land. We claim it, they claim it. Should we really fight over a little patch of land on the top part of Maine?
Yes.
People in Maine were saying that. The United States, we said, all right, we're not fighting over this. Yeah, there's some nice forests, a lot of moose up there, but it's not worth fighting a war over. And what is important with the 3 things of this, we have the Webster-Ashburton Treaty, which resolves all of those issues. And that's where it is a treaty with Britain. Realistically, from that point on, we have no major problems with Britain. But notice we're not fighting them. Actually, there'll be one other thing that will end up happening later on. All right, rise of third parties. In this next election that we have, there are several other parties. You see on our ballot here. Some of you know of Barack Obama and Mitt Romney that are running, but we have Thomas Stevens, we have Gary Johnson, we have Virgil Goode, Jill Stein, some of the parties that we have, the Libertarian, the Green Party, the Reform Party, the Socialist Party. Those are all third parties. They gonna get very many votes? No. All right, the Libertarians with Gary Johnson, usually here in Florida, he's gonna get somewhere between 1% and 3% of the vote, and that'll probably be the number 3 person here. So why are third parties even matter? These minor parties. Sometimes they take away votes. That's what happens. The Green Party took away votes in 2000. What else?
Green Party.
What?
What's the Green Party?
They're basically they're what we call a single issue party, because their single issue is the environment's the most important thing. And it was kind of ironic in 2000 where they got over 10,000 votes here in Florida. They were voting to kind of send a message to Al Gore that he's not environmental enough. So by them doing that, Al Gore lost the state of Florida, which lost the election, which put George W. Bush. Was the Green Party happy that George W. Bush was in office instead of Al Gore? So they've kind of learned to be careful who you vote for to send the message, because sometimes the message that you're trying to send might backfire on you, which the Green Party definitely did. Yeah, the Green Party was because they thought Al Gore was going to win that election, no problem. So that's why they were going to just show, here, you need to do more things this way. But this is where throughout history we have third parties, and if you get enough people, then other parties will start adapting some of the ideas you have. During this time period, we have 3 third parties that emerge. Notice one of them's in bold and a little more important than the other. The first third party is the Anti-Mason Party. Any guess of what the Anti-Masons are against? Okay, there you go. What are the Masons? All right, it's a secret society. Did you watch National Treasure?
I didn't think that was kind of relevant.
That is actually.
I know, but
The Masons were a secret society, and there's a lot of people that believe that this secret society has basically gone, and they formed our government. Why was Washington D.C. and a diamond? Okay, is there actually a map inside D.C. that the Masons have? Okay, so there's a lot of conspiracies that the Masons have. Well, that was going on in the 1800s also, that they had this. And so this group just wanted to they were against Mason. And the whole scheme of things, it's not real important, but it's one of our first third parties. It's a pretty easy one to remember because they're against the Masons. Their name gives it away. We would then have the American Party. What are the well, first of all, I think I have on for your notes. What is the American Party against?
British. French.
Well, what are they for, first of all?
American.
They're for Americans. So what are they against?
Everyone else.
Well, for immigrants. Wait, are we a nation of immigrants? So, right. It's one of those things that they are for native born, not Native Americans, native born. Okay? Even though your grandparents might be immigrants, okay? All right, that doesn't matter because you're American now. But we don't want any other immigrants. Okay? Kind of what some of the things that we have today. Now, they are also known as the Know Nothing Party. Okay, so if you see American Party, think Know Nothing Party. Let's go with that. The reason why is it was a secret society. And whenever anybody would ask, oh, you're a part of the American Party, and they'd ask them a question about it, they always said, I know nothing. So that's why they got nicknamed the Know Nothing Party. For some of you, that's your philosophy in life. I know nothing. Anyways. Liberty Party. What does the word liberty mean?
Freedom.
Freedom. So what is the Liberty Party against?
Slavery.
They're against slavery. So this is where this party. Now, the Liberty Party is a great example then of why a third party can be important. Because decades before the Civil War, we have a group of people saying slavery is wrong. The Whigs aren't saying it, the Democrats aren't saying it, and they say we have to have our own political party. And so eventually, the Liberty Party would be a part of the platform for the Republican Party against slavery. Alright, and that's where we'll stop for today. What was the American Party against? Yeah, they're against immigrants. And we're going to see them come up. How about the Liberty Party? What are they against? Against slavery. And this is where third parties usually they go. The Anti-Masons would join the Whigs. The Liberty Party would end up joining the Republican Party. We'll have another one called the Free Soil Party, which will have some things to do with anti-slavery, but will also have to do with
What was the Liberty Party was against
slavery. Right.
And the American was
Against the immigrants. All right, transportation, communication. This is where you've seen the American system go again and again. Here's where Henry Clay's influence is. He's trying to push through these bills, the internal improvements, canals and roads. We have steamboats that are not only where the Claremont had been around for a while by the time we get to the 1830s, or the steamboat after the Claremont, that was back in the early 1800s, but they've improved and gotten bigger and bigger. And by the time we get to the 1830s, 1840s, we have large steamboats going up and down. We have our first railroad line in 1830, which is not just for a monopoly game. What does the B and O stand for? Baltimore and Ohio. Guess where the railroad went? Right, but it connects the East with the Midwest. So it's kind of the same idea that you have with that, the old Northwest connected with the Northeast area. Now for communication. What's Morse code?
Morse.
And this is where Samuel Morse would invent the telegraph. Now, how does the telegraph change communication? In long distance, almost instantly. If you have a wire connecting it, then you can. It might be 200-300 miles. Now, if
Is
you
like telephone poles?
right, and there you'd have the same wires that we would use for telephone poles, but that's where originally it was with telegraph. And it's a pretty simple device that you have with the electric current when it goes through, and how long you hold it. That's why the dot, dot, dash, dash for the different letters. Now, it's not like you want to go and send a novel over it, but for short messages or something that happens. One thing that we had before this, and this is where communication before this time, this is where money comes in. We used to have what was called a flag corps. In between New York and Philadelphia, what was our two most important cities, they had on hillside, people would have binoculars, and then sometimes on the rooftops, different areas, and it would be a couple of miles or so away that they would do, and you would have flags, and they would send out stop quotes throughout the day, going all the way from New York City, using flags, the person write it down, then relay that information. Now you got one wire going from New York to Philadelphia, and you can send those same stock quotes. If there's news that happens, okay, it's not quite as instantaneous that we have today, but if something happened in New York, they could find out in Atlanta within a couple hours. Where before that time, it might be days or weeks before you would find out something. So the world is really speeding up, which kind of plays into some of the things that will go in our next section that we have with some of the reforms that we would have. All right, here's a bunch of inventions. The mechanical reaper, the McCormick reaper. Here's a picture of a reaper. It's a pretty simple thing. Some of you, if you look at it, if you think the old-timey rill mowers, you see that where they have the metal thing that goes around, that's basically what it is. It's a blade. How did you cut grain before we had this hauled by animals? Scythes. Right, it was like a machete, the scythe that you have. Or some of you, so if we're near Halloween, you know the Grim Reaper? And that's a longer reaper, and that's where you have a longer blade. Instead of having the small one, you have to swing and do this. All right, and it takes a long time to do it. Plus, it doesn't seem that hard. But it's kind of like any of you that have ever gone and dug a ditch. Is it very hard to use a shovel? But what happens if you go out and do it all day long?
Biggest turn.
All right. What if you're doing that 3-4 days in a row, sun up to sundown? And that's what would end up happening at the time that it was time to harvest the crops. This one invention, how you got this animal pulling this thing. Think how much work that saved.
What?
You could grow a lot more crops with less people. What then happens to those other people?
You don't ever talk about it.
Well, and this is where, like I talked about a little bit ago, about we have our digital change. Well, we have a change then that, well, we don't need as many farmers, but a lot of them now can move into the cities and these factories. And so we have more opportunity. What about for women? How is this going to affect women? Do we need as many women harvesting crops?
Well, we need to pick it up after it's cut.
Well, we might have that, but then you said you don't need quite as much. And so women aren't needed as much on the farm out in the field. So where are the women going to be?
Well,
In the house.
what's that amazing?
Wow.
All right, next invention, Charles Goodyear. When you see the name Goodyear, what should you think of?
Tires.
He did not invent rubber. Okay, God invented rubber. What he invented was the vulcanization of it, which is art. Before that time, and the best way to kind of put this, if any of you have ever had like one of those erasers, that you have like a rubber eraser, and notice, and it kind of just wears down real fast. Or you've seen rubber bands when they get after they get a little bit old, and you know how they break apart real easy. Well, think if tires were made out of that. As you're driving down the road, your tires are just going to get eaten apart real quick. The vulcanization of the rubber made it harder, and that made it where rubber was on there. What good is rubber?
Use it for a lot of stuff.
What was the tire made out before we put rubber around it?
Wood.
Wood.
It's an easier ride.
Yeah, it's a lot easier to ride. Plus, is it going to break as much? So, the advancement we have there with rubber. Elias Howe. He's the one, put a star by him, because almost everyone forgets about him. Goodyear's easy to remember. Our next one's real easy to remember. McCormick, some people usually remember McCormick, but Elias Howe. A sewing machine. What good would a sewing machine do?
Not good to dress like clothes by hand.
Yeah, not by hand. How much time do you think the sewing machine saved?
Like 5 hours at least.
Yeah, I mean, tremendous amount of time. So you see here, McCormick Reaper, the sewing machine. Now, most people, when you see the name Singer, that's where a lot of people think that Isaac Singer is the person that invented the sewing machine, because that's probably the most well-known sewing machine company. I know all of you know sewing machines, so you're saying, oh yeah, Singer, right? But some of you, if you see an older one, right? So, Eric Singer was a person that improved it, and he made with his company, and for the next 150 years, it was the #1 company in the world for making sewing machines for the United States. John Deere, he did not invent the plow. It had been around for a long time. He makes the steel plow. What was the plow made out of before that?
Grass.
Sometimes wood. What happened when you hit a rock when you had a wood plow? That broke. There were metal plows, except for it was made out of cast iron. Yeah, and this is where for cast iron, most of you, the only thing you know of cast iron is like a cast iron skillet. Now, think about you take where this plow is, instead of steel, you have a cast iron, and it can't curve quite as much because you can't move it around that much. It's a lot heavier, and still when you hit rocks, it's going to chip, it's going to rust more often. With the steel, they were able to make something sharper, more of a curve, and lighter. So he made a huge improvement. And what color did he make his plows?
Green.
That's not true, but. All right, unions. We haven't had anything with unions here, but now we have kind of our birth of our unions. Our first unions were from the Lowell factories. Remember we were hiring these young girls? Well, we get a group of girls together, young girls, that's not a good thing, right? Get a bunch of teenage girls together. Are they going to start complaining? So, well, they're complaining, and what some of our early unions, which you notice I don't have these underlined, I'll just, if you remember the names, great. If you don't remember the names, it's not one of those things that I'm expecting you to think in the future. Like you already know when we get to AFL, that's the name you got to. But our unions in the United States, most of our first unions start out by women that were working in these textiles mills. One of our first leaders is Sarah Bagley. She also will be, when we have women's rights, she'll be one fighting for that. early case to have. Even this is not a Supreme Court case, and they're in Commonwealth versus Hunt, though, said that unions were lawful and strikes were lawful. Now, what is a strike?
You refuse to work.
You refuse to work until what?
You get paid.
Or whatever
It's not
you
always
want.
just pay.
Whatever you want.
Right. And here's where collective bargaining comes in. Collective bargaining is a group. What is bargaining? What is it?
Collaborate.
Well, cooperating, you're trying to work for something here. So as a group, you are trying to work towards something. So as a union, and these are, no matter what, when we have anything with unions, what they are doing is collective bargaining. What's their number one weapon? Well, besides numbers, what do you do with those numbers? If you want something and they're not giving it to you, how are you going to get it? You strike. So just whatever union, no matter what time period we're talking about. A couple weeks ago in Chicago, we had the teachers strike. Okay, collective bargaining. Okay, how did they get for things? They went on strike. Right, the NFL refs. Okay, they went on strike. Now the key thing is about a strike, you better have something that people need. This is where, I'm going to where I was talking before, you need to have some sort of skill. If you have something necessary, if we're all working in a factory and you go on strike and you don't have a job that takes a whole lot of training, am I going to listen to you much?
No.
Meanwhile,
Everybody did
well, if everyone does it, but if you can replace everybody, yeah, it might take a while, but if we can bring in what are called scabs, which is another word you kind of need to know later on, is scabs, replacements there. But if we can replace you real easy, well, then it's not a big deal. But if you have a skill that I can't replace, then it's a whole nother thing. All right, meanwhile in the South, we have King Cotton. We haven't quite come to that term, but cotton is our number one economic thing in the United States, not just the South. It really is. This is where the video that we watched talk about the Panic of 1837, which is actually, when it was getting better, it gets worse when we end up having the prices of cotton drop in 1839. It makes it worse. So that's why it was actually 5 years. What's the peculiar institution? Yeah, slavery. So it kind of interchanged those words. Now, most people in the South did not own slaves. Over 90% of them didn't. And that's what sometimes where I said, what about plain folk? What about common, normal people? What if most of the people that were common, normal people in the South not living in the plantation houses, what did they do for a living? Yeah, they farmed. They were small farmers. Some of them are the upcountry farmers. This is where you think about the areas. You're not going to have big plantations in areas where you're mountains or the foothills of the mountains. So this is where you think of Tennessee, the mountains of North Carolina, what today is West Virginia. That's some of our upcountry farm. They're not going to have much with slavery in that area. All right, here's a couple things for slavery, just generalized things to have. Some of this we've had before, some we haven't. What's the difference between an urban slave and a rural slave? What's the difference between urban and rural? Taylor?
Urban's like more in the city, like they'll be helping around the house and stuff probably. And rural, they'll probably be like out on the fields, farming and stuff.
You're almost right. The urban, they're not, a lot of times they are in a house, and they would be household servants, and this is where we have house versus field slaves. They can be in a house slave can be in a city or in the country. But we do have slaves that will work where there are some factories in the South. And the way that you do for that, once again, I'm going to be the slave owner, y'all are my slaves. Okay? I don't like being a slave, but I can make you be it. So what ends up happening is if you're an urban slave, you go to a job, the only difference is I get your paycheck. And I might have like apartments that you live in. Now the good thing about that is you actually have a lot more freedom than on a plantation. All right, you got to be at work at 8 o'clock and you'll work, just a simple 12-hour day. So you work 8 to 8. But then you go home and you're cut. Yes, I basically provide everything for you. Your paycheck comes. Now, one nice thing about urban slaves, what if you wanted to work overtime? Jessica, 8 to 8, you decide you're going to work an extra 2 hours every day.
Keep your money.
Yeah, you actually got to keep, most of the time, you got to keep your own money. So what, Jessica, could you be saving up for if you're working overtime and you're a slave? You could buy your freedom or your kids' freedom. And that's where some of them were able to do that. If you're on my plantation and I say, all right, we got the cotton that we've got to pick, you're going to work an extra 2 hours today, you get paid any extra? No, you just are. So that's where the urban slaves had more freedom, they had a chance to. Would you rather be out on the plantation, a house slave, or a field slave? Most people think a house slave, but most of the time you didn't want to be. If you are a house slave, what are you going to be doing? Isn't that much nicer than being out in the heat picking cotton? But if all of you, let's say in here, all right, we have our house slaves over here. All right, get your nose in the air. Y'all think you're all better than us. And then, while the rest of us were out. And what ended up happening is we would have it as a field slave. Well, the next 3 days we got to pick this field. Can we talk to each other? Yeah. All right. Are there times that if we want to be a little bit lazier, we can kind of slow down a little bit? All right, pick it up a little bit later on.
Not a supervisor.
Well, if you have an overseer, but for the most part, you just get this done in the next 2 days. All right, one of you might be the overseer even. Meanwhile, you all study little house slaves. Guess what you got to do?
Clean up the babies.
Watch children.
Do you have to associate with your master?
No.
Yes.
Yeah.
Because the master is in the house.
Depends on the
Are you allowed to go and talk freely?
No.
No.
What those things depend on the relationship you have with the.
You might have, and this is where like some of them had their mammies, and you might have like a slave that was like almost like a nanny taking care of children, and you might have that close relationship with children. What if, and this is where if y'all would read some of the Brinkley book, what if you are an attractive young female, especially light-skinned, and you might be a house slave, and do you think there was ever any cases of rape?
Yep.
Yeah, many times. And it's where for the Brinkley book, they kind of go into it several different times. All right. But Dylan, instead, you're basically a butler. You stand there while, and it could be, what if the masters and the master's wife, they're talking about you? I mean, as if you're not even a person in their idea. Meanwhile, yeah, Trace is out picking cotton, but he's able to talk to Ben. And he does, while you stand there all day long and basically are degraded. You're in the shade, he's in the sun, but do you really want to be in there? And that's why you kind of have to think about that. All right, it seems on the surface that being a house slave, and in many ways that was nicer, but psychologically it would be a lot worse. There, you have less freedom, even though no matter what you're not free, but this is where you have less freedom. All right, a couple of words to kind of be familiar with. Pigeon. A lot of the areas of slaves, especially if you go to South Carolina and areas of Georgia, you had this language that came about. It was kind of a mixture of some African language with English, and own words were taken. There's a couple of islands in South Carolina and Georgia where black families had moved to on some of those sea islands, and they had their own languages on some of those islands because for decades after the Civil War, they lived there as for their family, and then realistically came up with their own language. All right. Now here's a couple other words. A Sambo, which actually there used to be a restaurant called Sambo's there, but here was a person that, and this is what for the South a lot of times they'd use, that they accepted slavery. Okay, that the slaves actually liked the idea. And one of the things that the South had that they would kind of say about how slavery was actually better than what the North would have. Because they had, and notice I put the word of the myth of the happy old slave. Now, what the thinking of this was, you're a slave for me. What happens if you get hurt? Do I get rid of you?
No. You pay a lot of money.
I mean, Who's going to buy a hurt slave? Mikey hurts his arm. He breaks his arm. Gets cut off.
Oh.
All right? You're not worth a whole lot of money for me anymore, but I can't kill you. Now I might, now I might become a house slave because you can't do as much work in the field, or you get something like that. Then what happens? But as you get older and older, once you get 50, 60 years old, do I still have to take care of you?
Yeah.
Yeah. So, and the idea that the South said is, oh, well, when he gets older, he just goes and lives in slave quarters. I'll still feed him, take care of him. Meanwhile, what's happening to these new immigrants working in the factories up north? What happens when one of them cut their arm off?
You just give it.
Oh, go
Yeah.
home, come back
They
tomorrow.
fire them and get another person off the boat. What happens when the immigrant worker gets too old?
Fire him.
Fire.
Does the factory owner take care of them anymore?
Nope.
And so this is why the South said, look, we have a better system for our lower rungs on the society. We're taking care of the lower rungs. But why do I say it's a myth?
Because many people didn't live that long.
Because
That's the key thing. How many people grew to a nice, ripe, old age in the South? And for the
What do they
slaves, it was a
consider
hard
old?
life. All right, it wasn't like when they're slaves that they always got the best of food. Okay, so this is where I had that. And during this time, we would have Nat Turner's Rebellion. I think we had Nat Turner Day a couple of weeks ago. But this was the biggest slave rebellion that happened on American soil in 1831. And the whole scheme of the world, it wasn't that big of a slave rebellion. They killed 55 whites. Now this is in Virginia. There were over 250, if I remember right, over 250 slaves that were punished for this. A lot of the slaves that were punished for this had no idea it even happened, and they were put to death or severely beaten. Why would that happen? If they weren't involved, why did they maybe get put to death or
They were
whatever?
afraid of
To
their
make
own
an
slave
example.
rebellion.
Well, that was part. And then what did you say?
Make an example.
Make an example of them. If let's say you all have all been slaves for me, and well, Jessica's been causing a lot of problems here. Now I have my opportunity. I can't by law. Now there were people that broke the laws, but there were laws that say you can't do certain things to slaves. But she's always been a rabble-rouser, a troublemaker. I just can't do it. I need to get rid of the troublemaker. No one wants to buy the troublemaker. I can't do it that way. So, here's my excuse to be able to show and then make an example of her to everyone else. And that's what happened to some of the slaves that had nothing to do with Nat Turner's Rebellion, but they're punished or killed just for that. All right, what about women? All right, have some things on here. First of all, one thing that we have, this is trivial, but our first college to accept women came about in 1837, Oberlin College in Ohio, which is still a very high-level liberal arts school in Ohio. But it was the first to accept females. There would be others that would come about. There were some good things that happened with the Industrial Revolution and the Agricultural Revolution that we would have. Now, Agricultural Revolution is talking about with McCormick and Deere making better equipment. What's some good stuff for women? Make their life easier? Sewing machine?
Yeah.
More jobs for women, if you're single. So that, I mean, there were a lot of things, and parts for life had. What's the bad side, though? If the woman isn't having to go and work in the field as much, why is that actually bad?
She loses more value.
Yeah, she loses her value. Where before, she wasn't equal to her husband as they're growing food. But now, the husband is the person bringing the food in. And what's the wife doing?
Making the money.
What?
Making the money.
No, not the husband's making the money.
Oh,
The wife.
making the food.
Yeah, making the food, taking care of the kids. The husband goes off and works with the Industrial Revolution. And what does the wife do?
Makes the food. Takes care of the house.
Yeah, takes care of the house, stays home, good. So for women, it actually, the Industrial Revolution in some ways lowers their status. They're not seen as equals. And this is where the cult of domesticity comes in. What I've used this term before, you had it in world history. Because the same thing's happening in England and France and other areas with the Industrial Revolution. I know one of my classes one time, they always remembered this as barefoot and pregnant, before we did that time. But in some ways you can kind of look at it. All right, the woman is to be in the home. Now, the idea on the good side is the woman is supposed to be continuing that Republican mother, raise the children in the right way. Women did not have a whole lot of rights though. And in fact, they would lose it. It's not just voting that they are fighting for. They're fighting for other rights, especially in the South. A lot of times women there would not be able to own property, or you would have to have your husband or brother for various things. And that would kind of go with, immigration. In the early 1800s, we start out in the 1800s, back in the Jefferson time period. What countries are most of our immigrants coming from? France, Scotland, England, some still from Scandinavia. So you think about the English countries, France, and Scandinavia. But then when we get to the mid-1800s, so we get to Jackson's time period, where would they be coming from then?
Ireland.
Ireland. Where else? Germany. Those would be the two main places that we have. And don't forget, with the early 1800s, even though they were forced, we still have from Africa there. By the time we get to the mid-1800s, we have outlawed bringing in slaves from other areas. Not that it didn't happen, but it was outlawed here. Irish potato famine brought a bunch of immigrants over. Now, we would also have, because of the Industrial Revolution and the Agricultural Revolution, they didn't need as many farmers and workers in Germany. So a lot of those families were moving over. If you look at this, do you see a spike in when Irish immigrants came to the United States? Could you, even though you probably can't read the years that they're doing it, can you label where probably the Irish potato famine occurred?
Right at the top.
So, all right, maybe it occurred during this time period.
It wasn't, didn't they actually, like, no food?
Well, let's see what happened. Even though potatoes are not native to Ireland, they are native to South America. But it was part of the Columbian Exchange. They grew very well in Ireland. But what happened was they planted it, and it was almost like a fungus that was growing. And you know, you can't, if you dig up a potato early and it's green, you can't eat it. You'll get sick if you eat it. So you can't. But right before it was mature enough, you would have this thing. It was like a fungus, and then when you dug it up, it was like a rotten potato. Now, that was the staple of their foods. And Ireland was an area that had a few very rich people and a whole lot of extremely poor people. And the poor people depended on potatoes as their main part of the diet. Very little meat, basically whatever little vegetables you could grow with that. But that was like where wheat and corn is for us in America. That was potatoes was their staple. And for most people, that's what they ate. Well, if you eliminate the potatoes, they don't have much food for normal people.
But why did they eliminate the
They couldn't afford.
Because it was that fungus. It was a disease.
What happened?
Oh, I thought that is how it was.
No, that's not.
If they could afford food, how could they afford to come all the way over here?
Well, and this is where they basically they would put together whatever little money. It didn't cost too much now because again, our transportation revolution made it cheaper for things. And here's where this question actually comes in for the next one. I said, what's the difference between the Irish and German immigrants? Most of the people that were coming from Ireland, most of them were young men. What education and what did they know how to do?
Yeah,
Nothing. They were truly dirt farmers, and many of them didn't even have animals, much less modern equipment. They were using wooden tools for some of these Irish immigrants that were coming over. So we have a bunch of dirty, ignorant, young men that come over to the United States to take whatever job they could get. How do you think they're treated when they get to the American cities?
Like sad.
Yeah, they're not treated real good. Meanwhile, the Germans. Germany, we had them come over in families. You gotta treat families different than a bunch of young men. Most of the Germans that came over, a lot of them came over, were very well educated. They came over for political reasons. They came over, again, and as groups. And here's where a bigger difference was. See, I think I have a question on here. Where did they settle? The Irish settled and I know there's not much room on your notes. The Irish settled in cities. The Germans went out, and they would go as groups of family and would move out into the countryside, and they would be farmers. And sometimes the Germans in different areas that they would go to in Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and areas like that, they would actually be a majority of the population. Yeah.
If the Irish were farmers, why did they settle in
Still on the
They didn't know how to farm the way that we had.
Oh.
Thus, they couldn't afford to go any further. They got passage to get to the city, and then they took whatever job they had. Now, here's where I have on the what is the effect of factory conditions. Remember when we had the little factory girls back in the 1820s? Now we get to the 1840s. Do we need to have safe factories? It's no longer respectable young women that are working in the factories. Who can you hire to work in those factories?
Little Irish boys.
Yeah, Irish. And what happens to if one of these dirty Irish end up getting injured? Yeah, just get another new one. Boats are coming in. And here I have down this sign, help wanted, no Irish allowed. Not the greatest thing to put up in here, but some of you might know the movie Blazing Saddles.
Yeah.
All right, and one thing in the movie Blazing Saddles, you have a section where they go through and they say when they're building this a town, and they use every little slur word you could use. Well, we'll accept this group, this group, this group, and this group, but no Irish. And there's where in New York City and places like that, there would be restaurants that would say, no Irish or dogs allowed.
Why?
The Irish were the absolute lowest in society in a lot of these northern cities.
Why then?
Why? Because, just because. Because, again, we're not talking about the rich Irish were not the ones that moved over.
Just
Okay?
because
This is where for America you have to realize there was this nativism, and get used to this word. It occurs no matter what time period. We have it today. Anyone know what nativism is?
They only like it because they're.
Well, to give you a definition, the favoring of native-born people over the immigrants. The favoring of native-born, not Native Americans.
But they were.
Is there any discrimination we have against Mexican Americans today? Yes. And you think about that, and it was worse against the Irish in the 1840s. Why is it that a lot of times people will have discrimination against Mexican Americans? Well, they're taking are they really taking our jobs?
No.
What jobs are when we have, whether they're legal or illegal, what jobs are
They're
they?
painting the wall.
Yeah, the ones we don't want to do. Guess what jobs the Irish took in New York City and Boston?
The ones we didn't want to do.
Yeah, you need sewer workers? Send the Irish down.
Ew.
Okay, I mean, it's here in Florida. I mean, we go. You look at for our agricultural pickers. I mean, most of you don't have that on their career on what your top jobs are. Oh yes, I want to be a tomato picker.
Yeah.
Okay. Oh wait, maybe no. No, I want to work and be a laborer for a roofing company. Okay, because you know, being in the summer heat on a roof, that's really a fun job to have. And this is where, remember that third party that we started out to stay with? The American Party, they're against immigrants, but in particular, what group of immigrants? The Irish. Alright, so that's the end of that section.
Why did they go south?
Oh. Why did the Irish not go to the South?
Slaves.
Yeah, did they need people to do the jobs that nobody wants to do in the South? No, you had slaves doing that. So if you were an immigrant and you moved to the South, are you going to get very much of a job? It wasn't that there weren't any Irish. Anybody know what city in the South had a lot of Irish move to? And it was where St. Patrick's Day party. No. City.
Is it in Florida?
No, it's in Georgia.
I don't know anything.
One of the places besides Chicago or Boston, if you want a big St. Patrick's Day party, all right, Savannah, Georgia. That's the one place in the South.
Oh my
right?
God.